Welcome to the National Civil Rights Museum's podcast, Imagine in America. This is more than a podcast, but a call to action, seeking truth against misinformation, giving voice to the unheard, and sparking a movement for justice and equity. I am your co-host, Dr. Russ Wigington, President of the National Civil Rights Museum, and I invite you on this journey. Today's episode is Critical Race Theory, America's Unresolved Past. We will explore the fact and fiction around the origins of CRT, how CRT is used today to suppress history or viewpoints, and ways CRT can instead be applied to achieve American ideals. I'm joined here by my good friend, Dr. Charles McKinney, Director of Africana Studies at Rhodes College and Associate Professor of History. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you.
I have a question about CRT from a scholar of your repute. What is CRT?
First off, very, very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So in a nutshell, critical race theory is a theoretical lens that we use to explore the relationship between race, racism, and power, and how that nexus of race, racism, and power actually impact American institutions, the law, housing policy, education policy, so on and so forth. And so it's a better set of tools constructed, as you said, in the 1980s by legal theorists to help us better understand the capacity for structural change, and also to help us better understand the structural barriers to the change that we say we are actually trying to seek.
Thank you for that. And so how would you describe as the usage of critical race theory as suppressing viewpoints?
I think in terms of the suppressing of viewpoints, I think one of the viewpoints that's being suppressed in the current moment, right, is the suppressing of points in terms of advocates of critical race theory, right? Those advocates are suggesting that in order for us to truly build an egalitarian society, we've got to come to grips with the ways in which race and racism are woven into the fabric of American institutions, are woven into the law, are woven in, again, into housing policy, educational policy, so on and so forth, right? And so in order for us to move there, we've got to push past the ways in which CRT has been suppressed in the current moment.
So we know that in this current moment, there's multiple perceptions and ideas and fears related to critical race theory.
Right.
How do we maneuver past that barrier so that we can engage in the kind of conversation that I think our country deserves?
It's a great question. One of the things that we're going to have to do collectively is to affirm that history matters, right? Is to affirm that the actions of the past have consequences for all of us, right? And we know this on a basic level, on a foundational level. And this is one of the reasons why critical race theory laws that have been passed, anti-CRT laws across the country that have been passed have been so vague, because it's really hard to sort of dig into some of the more substantive motivations with regard to CRT, right? So the push against CRT is blunting the instruments that we have at our disposal to have conversations about the impact of race and racism in the past. If we can't talk about that, then we can't talk about current levels and current realities with regard to discrimination, with regard to inequality, with regard to the structural barriers that so many Americans still face. And so again, CRT is a really crucial instrument that we've got to fight for and we've got to advocate for if we want to build the type of country we say we want to build.
And certainly as you were talking, I'm thinking about the work that we do here at the National Civil Rights Museum, and I think one of our gifts is that we allow people to enter this space wherever they may be, if you will, from perspective to ideas that they may have about the history of this country, all different sorts of ways that people are able to enter this place. and give them a framework by which to have an experience that can be transformative. How do we help people enter who may be uncomfortable with knowing more about the past for whatever reason, across all the spectrums? What are some potential ways we can help people enter into that space? Maybe just stick their toe in the water, if you will, to see if they want to take a deeper dive.
So that's a great question. And one of the first thing that I think of, right, is we're sitting in the section of the museum that talks about the Brown decision, right? So over here off camera are the Little Rock Nine and all of the statistics we see about all of these individuals, these brave individuals, right? 9 folks in Little Rock, somebody in Arizona, somebody in Arkansas, somebody out in California, and all of the brave work that they did to try and integrate the schools, right? So a person can come in and see this exhibit and see and hear Thurgood Marshall talk about the Brown decision, and we hear and see how the sausage was made in terms of the NAACP's ultimately successful fight to get legal segregation overturned. And so we can see this moment as a moment of triumph, and in some ways a moment of culmination. But we also know and understand that American institutions, American educational institutions, are more segregated now than they were 30 years ago, right? So, and that's what our friend Hassan Jeffries calls that hard history that we have to grapple with. The National Civil Rights Museum is a really great place to start in terms of grappling with the hard history. Yes, we've had some triumphs in previous years. Yes, we've overcome some barriers. Things have certainly changed, right? My parents grew up in rural Arkansas in the 1930s and 40s, right? So my dad started his day on the way to middle school by picking 200 pounds of cotton first, and then went to 7th grade, right? So that's different, right? Little Chuck McKinney didn't have to pick 200 pounds of cotton, right? So we can chart the progress, but at the same time, right, the museum gives us the opportunity to say, if we're looking at change over time, how much change have we actually made? How much progress have we actually made? And what are the ways in which that progress has been eroded over the last couple of decades, right? This was a Herculean effort to get 9 black kids into one school. There was a riot, right? The governor stood basically in the schoolhouse door, and we're going to see that repeated time and time and time again. So back to critical race theory. Critical race theory gives us the opportunity to say, okay, what actually are the barriers in these moments, and what are the nature of those barriers? Those barriers are structural. Those barriers are legal. Those barriers are cultural, political, economic, so on and so forth. And so again, back to the Civil Rights Museum, this place gives us an opportunity to enter into these longer, broader conversations.
No, I really appreciate that. And it sounds like part of what you're saying is do the work to find out the moments of progress and appreciate those. But don't just stop there. Put your critical eye on what has that meant over time. What does that mean today? And dare I say, what could that mean for tomorrow? It sounds like, as a scholar and historian, you're encouraging us to think about aspects of that, but to push forward and think about what does that mean today and tomorrow.
Yes, push forward, and always remember what Frederick Douglass told us, right? With no struggle, there's no progress, right? So this moment in 1957 that I'm looking at, these moments in 1960, these moments didn't unfold because a bunch of people just sort of went, right? These moments are a function of struggle. These moments are a function of a movement, of a group of folks who said, look, in order for us to change these circumstances, right, we have to think beyond ourselves, beyond our communities. We have to change the structure of American society, right? So if we still are facing hurdles and barriers and obstacles, we have to ask the same types of questions that we asked in previous decades in terms of what are the structures in American society that need to be transformed in order for us to, in the words of Baldwin, to achieve our country. And again, places like the Civil Rights Museum and theoretical tools like critical race theory, right, are both indispensable in this moment to help us to, again, achieve our country.
Yep. And so back, sort of be returning back to thinking about a broad swath of people. The folks who think that putting a critical eye, if you will, on our history and thinking about the structures that we need to repair, and then transitioning into sort of the concern that I've heard people say about that having some unpatriotic dimensions. How would you respond to that notion, if you will?
Well, this is a children's program, so I'll respond appropriately, right? So when you look at the laws, the anti-CRT laws that have been passed in the 20 plus states in the union, right? They're intentionally vague. They talk about, you know what, let's not discuss things that might make particular students feel uncomfortable, right? And the default mode there is almost always white students, right? So, okay, we don't want to talk about things that make us uncomfortable. We don't want to talk about, we're not allowed to talk about in many instances of clear racial inequality, right? And the ways in which the state play a hand in enforcing and facilitating that inequality. Those laws will say, don't make comment, don't make reference to individuals who believe that one race was superior to another race, for instance, right? Well, that's the majority of American history, right? For the majority of American history, white folks thought that they were superior to black folks. Now, I didn't make that up, right? I'm not trying to be mean to white people, but that's what slavery was. That's what segregation was, right? So we can't get around that reality. We can't get around the reality that under the institution of slavery, it's illegal for people who look like me and you to learn how to read and write upon pain of death, right? When we talk about
one of the most dangerous things you could do.
One of the most dangerous things you could do. 90% of the wealth in this country is inherited, right? Which means that some folks' grandparents had access to capital. Some folks' great-grandparents had access to capital. But for me and you, our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents, they were the capital. They were the capital, right? So those are two fundamentally different positions.
Yeah.
And so we are all diminished, right? The entire nation is diminished when we refuse to recognize and honor this history. I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but boy, you just hit on a point there when you said we're all diminished, and that made me think about the impact on black students as well, and to not assume that they could feel some kind of way about this history. Yeah.
And if you don't curate and do it with thoughtfulness and fact-based, they're not necessarily, they may be just as uncomfortable as the white students in this conversation.
Right. There's a lot of discomfort to go around.
Yes.
Right. And there's discomfort on almost every element, every aspect of American history. Again, if you move away from the triumphalist narrative of the history, right, which is that America inevitably becomes freer, right, becomes better, becomes more inclusive. That's a fiction. That's not what happens, right? That's not what happened. So again, the history is hard, but that doesn't mean it's unteachable.
Yes.
Right? That doesn't mean that there aren't points, there aren't individuals and instances and moments of deep and profound and transformative humanity that we can all cling to.
Yes.
Right? So we can talk about the horrors of slavery, for instance, and we can also talk about all the multiple ways that African Americans confronted that horror. We can talk about, right? We can talk about white investment in racial subordination. But we can also find pockets in places and spaces where white folks are like, wait a minute, this is a problem, economically, politically, and morally, right? So we've got multiple voices that we can access, but if we have to shut the whole conversation down because somebody feels uncomfortable, right, then we lose the opportunity, right, to A, teach the history, but to B, also give everybody opportunities to figure out who those heroes are, right, in the past that they can cling to and speak to and say, hey, you know what? Wow, yeah, this is somebody I need to know about, right? In Omni Americans, this great book, Albert Murray.
Yes.
He says the greatest American of the 19th century, Harriet Tubman, not Lincoln, right? Not even Douglas, Harriet Tubman, right? He's like, look at her resume, look at what she does. How is she not somebody who should be inspirational, not just to black people, right, but to everybody? She is a G, right? I mean, Robert Smalls, who stows away on a steamboat and literally sails himself out of slavery, right? I mean, there are so many stories, right? And those stories, everybody should be like, wow, that's pretty badass, right?
Yeah.
Everybody, regardless of race,
That's
regardless of nationality, regardless of where they're from, whether they're northern or southern. Yeah. And so when we shrink down and when we contract the teaching of African American history, because that's what these CRT bills are actually trying to do, right? They're trying to contract and shrink and diminish our capacity to teach the fullness of African American history, and thereby extension the fullness of American history, right? When we do that, again, everybody loses, everybody's diminished.
As you framed that out so eloquently, it reminds me of the commentary I hear, and so many of us who work at the National Civil Rights Museum hear regularly from our visitors, again, who come from across the spectrum in location and age and demographic and country, how comprehensive and insightful and nuanced the experience is here. You can find yourself in some form or fashion in this place, and it's not just because of some magical act, if you will. It's really in between the cracks where people begin to see themselves and see the brilliance, if you will, of so many people in our country historically and how that translates to today. I'm biased, but I do think that every time I hear that comment from here, it's almost like I want to say, if you could experience this place, if more people experience this place, they would find that their concerns, imaginary or not, can be relieved, not because of their discomfort goes away, because there's some uncomfortable places in this museum for everybody.
No doubt.
But you get answers and rationale to where your discomfort may lie. And so making sure people have the opportunity to dive into that dimension, I think, is something that is really important. Want to shift gears a little bit in the context of thinking about the narrative around critical race theory. If you were, and I think this should happen, if you were for king for a day, this conversation is going to be happening for a while in our country. What would be, what would the conversation be in 2030, if we were to fast forward a little bit, about our nation's history? How would we frame that out to tell that story?
King for a day. Well, right, like after the endless tacos. Right? In 2030, the conversations that we would be having, right? I would have tried to figure out a way for us to actually be invested as a nation, right? For us to actually be invested in an accurate and honest understanding of our past, right? And if we moved in that direction, then conceivably that could reshape a whole lot of conversations that we are having about a whole host of things, right? So then, for instance, right, in the states in the union that have the highest rates of bad health, right? Those states are overlaid with poverty. Those states these are southern states, right? Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, so on and so forth. Right, what does it look like to have conversations on the state level and on the federal level that say, hey, you know what? The choices that we are making in the current moment are deeply shadowed by the choices that we made in the past, so that we could ensure, right, 2 tiers of society in our states, in our region, in our country, right? We made explicit decisions, right, in the first half of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, right? And now we're taking a hit for that. So what does it mean to decouple the choices that we're making now from the choices that we made in the past? Right? And to actually live up to, again, this creed about, you know what, if we believe that everybody's created equal, if we believe that we are all endowed with certain inalienable rights, then clearly we've got to be making a different set of choices so that we don't have disproportionate numbers of people without access to health care, disproportionate numbers of people without access to clean water, disproportionate numbers of people who are poor and working class and people of color living in environmentally toxic zones, so on and so forth, right? So if we understand the origins of this story, then we can write a better conclusion to this story.
That's profound, and I think about this 2030 moment. What I think I heard you say is we're resetting the foundation by which everyone enters conversations about this country. And until we do that, we run the risk of there being disproportionate amounts of knowledge and understanding in too few and too small of pockets, if you will, and a really significant number of people who don't have the foundational dimensions by which to have a legitimate opinion about where they land on issues, right? Some of this is just straight up fact. You have to understand the facts before you can have some places of nuance, if you will, or potential disagreement.
Right.
We have to recognize, and perhaps what I heard you say is, we have to validate that slavery was more than a 20-year experiment and talk about all the phases of it before we can have a legitimate conversation about what the Civil War, for example, was about. And we're going to have a bunch of disagreement over that, but if we don't acknowledge the dimensions of slavery, it's hard to have that be situated in the conversation. I'm just using that as one example.
No, right. So, so one of the things, right, a lot of us historians believe that, sort of culturally and historically, right, the South won the Civil War because they're able to, Southerners were able to write a narrative about this little skirmish that we call the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on where you grew up, right? And so we've been really successful, the country, right? Not just the region, but the country has been really successful at minimizing the scope and the enormity of the institution of slavery, right? 4 million people in 1860, 4 million people are worth $3 billion. That's more than all of the money in all of the banks. If you put all the money in all of the banks in the United States, all of the money in all of the railroads in the United States, doesn't even come close, right, to the $3 billion that African Americans are worth in 1860. The only thing worth more than 4 million people is the land itself. There's no other greater value, right? So we're talking about, and then do the math, right? $3 billion in 1860. What is that in 2023, right? So then we're talking about a nice little piece of change here, right? So that wealth, you can use the people that you own for credit, right? I'm good for it. Give me that. Let me have that house. Let me have that wagon. Let me go in on this business. What's your credit? The 10 people that I own, right? So this is wealth. So these are bodies. These are people generating wealth in addition to their labor, right? So we're talking about a huge piece of wealth, and we're talking about wealth that has implications far beyond the laboring of people in the fields in the American South, right? billions of dollars being funneled into northern companies and institutions. You ever heard of Brown University? The Brown brothers. This is their first fortune, like the financing of slaves and insurance, right? Ever heard of Harvard University, right? Harvard Law School. When you go to the Harvard Law Library, you look at the crest of Harvard Law Library, one of the symbols in the crest is a sugar cane. They don't grow sugar in Boston. What's that about? Well, the guy who endows Harvard Law School, right, is filthy rich because the slaves that he owns are cultivating sugar. And rich enough for him to endow the library, right? So slavery money, we're swimming in it, right? Still, now, in 2023, right? So we've got to reframe the conversation about slavery to understand, right, the enormity of the institution, but also the generational impact of the institution. Again, what does it mean if your great-grandfather was the capital, did not have access to loans, did not have access to education, did not have access to health care, so on and so forth, right? There's a generational impact of that. We understand the wealth is built across generations, right? Nobody blinks an eye when you say that the Rockefellers started earning their money in the 19th century. Well, that's just a fact. And that money grew, right? Well, at the same time, there are several million people in the country who are being systematically barred from, right, the ability to create wealth in the same sorts of ways that white folks are able to have access to, right? So again, we've got to grapple with the enormity of that moment and the way in which that moment reverberates down across time, down to now in many instances, right? So when you start to have a conversation that's honest about the capacious nature of the institution, when you start having conversations that are honest about the benefits of the institution for states, for individuals, for the nation, right? When you start having longer conversations about the detriments and how they play out over the course of generations, then we can start to have different conversations about how we handle, how do we remediate, how do we repair this breach that has been inflicted upon American citizens.
Sure.
Right? That's the other thing here that's so crucial. We're not talking about a group of people who live on Pluto, right? We're talking about folks who were born here, right? Who were damaged here, right? Who have labored in spite of these barriers, who have made a way out of no way in spite of all of these obstacles. Yet and still, right? When we refuse to ignore, or when we refuse to recognize those barriers and those challenges and those obstacles, not just those individuals are diminished, but we as a nation are diminished.
Thank you for that. And I want to circle back to your reference to the Brown decision in this space where we're sitting, where it's highlighted, and that being, I think, an important marker in our country, legally, less so perhaps in practice over time, but legally being a very important marker. And markers like that as being sort of the kind of the before and after, if you will. Now folks can go to whatever school, and now folks can vote, now folks are citizens, and all of these important or have their civil rights, if you will, these important markers. What do you think about the argument of how that has complicated, if you will, and perhaps even created spaces where that's allowed us, if you will, to get to this noise around critical race theory today? The ability, I guess what I'm saying is the ability to say, didn't we solve that? Don't we have laws that we're bound by now that we didn't have 50 years ago, 60 years ago? How do you respond to what those markers meant and what they mean today?
Well, I think this is where critical race theory comes in really handy, right? Because with critical race theory, again, this remix, this reassessment of the nexus of race, racism, and power, right? With this new theoretical lens, we go back in time and really critically assess and really critically reassess, right, the impact of these particular moments, right? So yes, Brown is transformative. Brown is transformative in a host of ways, and still, right, that triumph, right, is almost immediately eroded, right, by the actions of the court itself, right, by the actions of the federal government and by the actions of governors and, and school boards and school districts all across the country, right? After Brown, May 1954, a reporter asks Thurgood Marshall, how long do you think before all of the schools in America are integrated? And he says, oh, it should take about 20 years. Right? The level of optimism that he has, right, with regard to the expectation that, hey, you know what? The court has spoken, and so now the federal government's going to adjust itself accordingly. And now state and local governments are going to adjust themselves accordingly because the highest court in the land has said segregation has no place in American life. 1954, 1957, Southern Manifesto, right? Where almost all of the Southern senators and 80 some odd, congressmen from the American South say, no, we're not enforcing that. That's a violation of our rights. Negroes are happy with segregation. We know our Negroes better than the court does. You are outsiders. This is constitutionally unsound, and we're not enforcing the law. No. Now, critical race theory gives us an opportunity to hold that to account, to also make that a part of the story of Brown, right? Because in the triumphalist version of the story, right, schools are integrated and we all lived happily ever after. That's not what happened. Right? It took 20 years here in Memphis before we even started to desegregate the schools, as you well know, right? At the time where Thurgood Marshall said we should be just about wrapped up with that, we had just started, right? And to the chagrin of a whole bunch of folks. So again, the institutions that are responsible for getting us at that point are the same institutions that are responsible for eroding that point, right? And diminishing the capacity to actually enforce the law. So we have to understand that in its totality, right? So that we can have an analysis and an understanding of why there's such high levels of segregation in American public schools now, in 2023, right? That's not a mystery. We've got to demystify that process. We've got to demystify the choices, right, that presidents are making, the choices that judges are making, the choices that Congress is making with regard to education, with regard to segregation, with regard to the distribution of funds and resources.
Our museum staff had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Claiborne Carson, founding historian of Stanford's Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute and 2023 Freedom Award honoree. Let's hear what he has to say about CRT and the lack of vision.
As a college professor, what obstacles did you and your colleagues face in developing African American history courses at Stanford? And are there parallels to this opposition and the controversy around critical race theory today?
Certainly. You're trying to look at people who lack a vision for looking around at the world and saying, I understand that world, but it could be better. And some people feel threatened by that, particularly people in positions of authority. Are you criticizing the work that we're doing? Yes, it needs to be criticized, but that's part of the process. What is this country? Look at the United States. It started with a criticism, the Declaration of Independence. Yes, Britain, you're an okay society, but you've made some bad mistakes and we're going to separate from you. So you always have this tension between the old and the new. You have the people who are looking at the society and saying it could be better. And that vision, that's what Martin Luther King, that's what the young people in SNCC brought to it, is that vision of looking at the world and saying, we can make it better. We can make a better world. And that takes a lot of self-confidence, patience, because it's going to be, and then when you've got it done, you'll have another generation looking at it and saying, yeah, you brought about a better world, but we can still see a lot of things that are wrong with it. And that's the process of change, is that it takes the visionaries.
Right.
And I think that's one thing that brings the young people in SNCC and Martin Luther King. They were all visionaries. They were all people who could look at reality and saying, not only it could be better, but I'm going to make it better. And I'm willing to take risks to do that.
Wow.
And that's what you need in every generation.
So Dr. McKinney, in listening to Dr. Carson's comments about the lack of vision that currently exists in driving the critical race theory argument, how would you respond if Dr. Carson were here and you all were in conversation? How would you respond to them?
Well, I think he's right, and I think we have to take up the call, right? 10 toes down, right? We've got to redouble our efforts to create the spaces where we can have fuller, broader, more honest conversations about our past, the ways in which race, racism, and power have played out in our past, right? The impact of those dynamics on our institutions, on our values, on our ethics, on our politics, in our way of life, right? So, yes, we need people of vision, and we need more and more folks brave enough to weather the storm that inevitably arrives, right, when we have these conversations about hard history, particularly in a climate where we've got a whole bunch of folks who are explicitly saying we don't want to have these particular sorts of conversations.
Sure. Well, we at the National Civil Rights Museum want to be part of the solution. In fact, it's non-negotiable. It's part of the responsibility. We're obligated to do our best to be part of the solution. What are some things you recommend? You've already spoken to a few dimensions of it. What can we do, perhaps both at the National Civil Rights Museum, but we who care deeply about not just this topic, but the future of our country? What are some recommendations that you have for us? Where do we go from here, if I can borrow from Dr. King's words?
So, number one, continue to preach the gospel, right? Continue to be the Civil Rights Museum. One of the things that I've appreciated in recent years, right, particularly under your leadership, is the ways in which you all are starting to have more expansive conversations about the contemporary moment, right? I think that's a very necessary step, a step in the right direction, right? In order for us to push away from, again, the triumphalist narrative that we had a movement back in the day, it was successful and we fixed everything, right? We had a civil rights movement. Michael Jordan hit the NBA and then Beyonce, right? I mean, it's a little more complicated than that. So you all have been increasingly better, right, about creating spaces for us to have these conversations about the contemporary moment. And the other thing, when we push back away from a triumphalist narrative, one of the things that I constantly have to remind my students of is that it's not like civil rights activists and leaders got together and just were like a bunch of bobbleheads and all agreed on everything, right? Having a revolution, right, engaging in a social movement, trying to change the fabric of your society, there's a whole lot of knockdown, drag-out fights involved in that, right? How do we move forward? What do we do? Nonviolence, self-defense, right? Focus on the federal government, focus on the neighborhoods, right? Focus on institutions, focus on families, so on and so forth, right? So there's all manner of conversations, debates, raging dialogues and debates that people are having about what this movement should look like and how it should move forward, right? So that's the other thing, right? We've got to create more spaces in our society where we're not afraid to have knockdown, drag-out fights about where we are and where we should go.
So what I think I hear you say is, even if you are fundamentally and philosophically in an agreed upon space, that's just the beginning of the work to be done. Sort of sitting in that space is not declaring victory. That's where you begin from that spot, perhaps, and then you get busy about differentiating and working through your respective differences on how to get to the next level.
Yes. So it's always important to create those spaces. It's always important to create spaces where people of divergent views and opinions and viewpoints and philosophies and experiences can come together and have these conversations. Now, also, having said that, right, the four brothers who decided to start a sit-in at North Carolina A&T students, go Aggies, in Greensboro, North Carolina, in February of 1960, they didn't have a broad consensus. Mm-hmm. They didn't go to church and announce, hey, y'all, we're going to start a sit-in. What do we think? Because if they had done that, the overwhelming response would have been no. Right? Hey, Big Mama, I'm going to go downtown and get arrested. What do you think? Big Mama, are you crazy? Right? And I talk to my students about this all the time, too. In the abstract, a bunch of 19-year-olds going down to Mississippi in 1964 for Freedom Summer, in the abstract, that sounds great, fine. Yes, somebody else's kid should go. I'm the father of 3 now. What's my response when my 19-year-old, who's a sophomore at Howard right now, says, hey, Dad, it's 1964. I want to go down where the racial terrorists are and engage in civil rights work? What's my response to that question?
That's exactly.
You're my baby. And you want to do what? How about we write a check?
That's right.
Right? How about you engage in some work in DC? So it's a different narrative when it's, when it's my kid asking. So there's different possibilities, there's different outcomes. And so all of that is to say, the civil rights movement is not the work of consensus. It's the work of a group of people who were always in the minority, who then go on to build a new consensus. Right? So just because we don't have everybody on board with our vision of how the world should change moving forward doesn't mean we don't move. Right? There's a whole bunch of people in American society who are perfectly fine with the way policing operates in this country. I am not one of those people. And so what we are in the process of doing is building a new consensus around policing in American society. That consensus was not built at the highest levels of that society. It was built by brothers and sisters out in the streets in the wake of insert dead black person here, in the wake of Michael Brown, in the wake of Tyree Nichols, in the wake of Trayvon Martin, in the wake of so on and so forth, right? So again, consensus, or the quest to build consensus, can never stop us from doing what we know to be right.
Well, there couldn't be anything more true than what you just described. I'm reminded, as the country celebrates Dr. King's birthday, and that will happen in all forms and has happened in all forms and fashions. I'm always reminded that on the eve of his death, the unpopularity that he had in this country, the Gallup polls revealing close to a 70% disapproval rating, that crossed all sorts of lines.
Right.
But that didn't stop him. That didn't stop the movement in the past, and that won't stop the movements of the future. Dr. McKinney, thank you for your wisdom, insights, and perspective on this very important topic of critical race theory.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
We hope you were enlightened and inspired by today's episode. We invite you to take the conversation further in your circles of influence. It starts in your backyard. We hope you will implore your local judicial system, vote for local and state judges. We'd love to hear from you. Connect with us at civilrightsmuseum.org, imagineanamerica.org, and our social media platforms. History isn't behind us. It lives in every moment. Our struggles are relevant as today's headlines, offering a context that makes sense of the now. We're not a static archive. We are a dynamic forum, forever evolving, always resonating. At the National Civil Rights Museum, history moves us forward. Visit civilrightsmuseum.org. Today's episode is brought to you by the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel, the assassination site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It chronicles key episodes of the American Civil Rights Movement, examines today's global civil and human rights issues, provokes thoughtful debate, and serves as a catalyst for positive social change.